All right, welcome everyone to the Backyard Farming Small Ruminant series. This is our last session for this particular series. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Brittany Fletcher. She is the University of Maryland Extension Ruminant Specialist.
All right, thanks, Megan, and thank you everyone for joining in. My background is in ruminant nutrition, so this is a topic that I could talk for ages about and still not tell you absolutely everything that there is to know. But we're going to go over all different kinds of things tonight. We're going to go over some practical feeding strategies. We're going to go over why we feed the way we feed, and kind of why we do what we do and best management practices and rules of thumb. So the first thing that you need to know about our small ruminants is that they are in fact ruminant animals. So if this is your first exposure to sheep and goats and raising them, and you've raised chickens or pigs before, they are a completely different beast. So they have a 4-compartment stomach that you can see over here to the right. And what this allows them to do is they are able to digest fiber. So they can take things that are not as easily digestible or necessarily shouldn't be digested by our monogastrics, such as pigs and chickens and you and I. And it can actually turn it into byproducts that then the microbes are able to utilize to create energy for the animal. And so basically that rumen and its system is a big fermentation vat. And so they're able to take in grass and shrubs and forbs, and they're able to take that in. What they do is they chew it, they swallow it, they let it simmer in that rumen environment where it gets attacked by microbes and it churns. And then what they do is they regurgitate it and they re-chew what we like to call their cud. And so this active rumination allows them to have more exposure to breaking down those really difficult fiber particles in order for them to be able to use everything well. And so by nature, our sheep are what we consider our intermediate grazers. So cattle are going to be our regular grazers with like buffalo and bison. And so they will primarily eat grass. Sheep are intermediate grazers, so they will prefer grasses as well as forbs. So like they'll eat things like wildflowers, they'll eat things with a little bit more leaf content, that have a little bit more stem, while our goats are what we consider browsers. And so they prefer shrubs and forbs. They will actually strip the bark right off of trees. That's why they're so agile, is because they can get up into those bushes and larger trees and eat different things that aren't necessarily going to be liked by our larger ruminants, such as sheep and cattle. And to kind of be able to understand what you're looking at when it comes to looking at a feed tag, looking at a forage analysis, you have to know what nutrients are required by our animals and then how they translate into a feed tag or to when you're getting your forage analyzed. And so there are 6 classes of nutrients. We have our carbohydrates, protein, fat, water, vitamins, and minerals. And every single one of these is a required nutrient. One can't function without the other. And so when you're looking at a feed tag, our carbohydrates will be demonstrated as crude fiber, acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, and starch. Protein will show up as our crude protein, or it'll be abbreviated as CP. Fat, nice and easy, will be crude fat. Our water that we're talking about when it comes to our feed will be expressed as a dry matter percentage. So this is when we take that moisture out of a feed ingredient so that we can compare apples to apples instead of oranges to apples, because a really wet dried distiller's grains is going to be a lot more moist than a sun-cured alfalfa. And so we want to be able to take all water out of it and compare them against each other. Our vitamins are nice and easy. They will be listed as vitamins. And then our minerals will be listed as ash or minerals. Now, the one that kind of encompasses a whole bunch of different ingredients are the things that talk about energy. So our 3 nutrients that give off energy are carbohydrates, protein, and fat, with fat being the most energetic. It will give off about 9 times energy, whereas carbs and protein will give about 4 times the energy. And so these will be nice, big, fancy equation, but we like to call them total digestible nutrients, or TDN, on our feed tags and our forage analysis. So TDN and crude protein are going to typically be the things that you're going to look at and consider most when you're talking about feeding. And then in order to understand if you are correctly feeding your livestock well, you have to understand how that feed going into the body translate into what's happening on the body. And so we call this a body condition score. And so we use it as ways to classify mature livestock based on how much fat they have. So if we're feeding them well, they're going to put fat on. If we are not feeding them well, they will be skinny. You can use the same idea in growing livestock, but it's mostly for mature livestock because growing livestock change so rapidly overnight. It's not as easy of a thing to kind of identify. It is very subjective. The more that you are able to get your hands on your animals and other animals and figure out what's a skinny one, what's a fat one, and what's kind of right in between, you'll get better at it. But it does indicate that nutritional status, and it's from a score of 1 to 5. So to kind of get a body condition score, you start by kind of looking down their spine and seeing if you can see all of their ribs, or excuse me, all of their spinous processes. And so if they're really skinny, it's going to feel like the back of your knuckles when you're making a fist. And so it's going to be really, really raw against your hands. And then the fatter that they get, it'll start to be like you're extending your fingers out and you're just barely able to feel those back knuckles. You can also evaluate them by looking over the side of their loins and then also just kind of feeling that whole process interacting with one another. Our body condition score of 1 is going to be over here on the left. This is an extremely emaciated animal. We never want our animals to get to this point under any circumstance. It is possible that they can get to a score 2 if they're in a really high energy demand and we're not quite meeting that nutritional status. So if we're not feeding well after they've been lactating for a couple of weeks, they can start to get a little bit thin. Where we kind of want all livestock to be is at a 3 or a 3.5. We want them to have a little bit of fat over their back. We want to not be able to see every rib, but we still do want to be able to feel that spine going down their back. 4 is kind of like that happy, healthy, everything's good. They've got enough fat that if they weren't able to get feed for a little while or something was lower, they can definitely still survive, but they're not at the point where they're too fat. And obese, pretty self-explanatory. You will know an obese animal when you see one. And so before we dive into the specifics, there are some general rules of thumb that can make life a little bit easier and a little less daunting. The most important thing when you are feeding your livestock is to make sure that the forage or the grain or concentrates that you are feeding them are mold-free. You want to make sure that it's clean, that it's not going to cause any issues, and that it is not getting wet, that you're storing it properly, because mold can lead to diseases, and diseases can make your life a lot more difficult. Different ways of feeding our roughages include putting them out on pasture, giving them hay, giving them silage, which is a fully anaerobic fermentation, and then there's baleage, where it's not quite as fermented for as long, or grains, so corn, barley, wheat, or a complete feed, so a 16% crude protein from the co-op down the street. Those are going to be what we call complete feeds. They're formulated to meet all nutritional requirements, and they've got vitamins, minerals, all that added in there. The next most important thing that you want to do when you're getting started with especially grazing or feeding hay is you want to get a nutrient analysis done. And there's lots of great resources out there on how to teach you how to take a forage sample or a hay sample, but you want to go ahead and do that and send that off to a laboratory to get analyzed so that you know exactly what you're feeding, because more often than not, we think we know what our nutrients are, and Mother Nature likes to play cruel tricks. And so sometimes it'll be a really good year on pasture and sometimes it'll be a really bad year on pasture. So we want to know what's in that forage. We also need to know that no matter what's going on, if we are going to change the feed of our ruminant livestock, we need to make those changes gradually. The more abruptly that you change their diet, the more abruptly that their rumen gets upset. And we do not want an upset rumen. We want everything to go smoothly. So if you're going to switch from all pasture to introducing grain, you want to introduce it very slowly with small amounts before you're putting them on full feed. Water must always be clean and must always be available. That's easier said than done for most people. But if you've got smaller amounts of livestock, ensure that it's at least always clean. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily every single day the trough has to be filled completely to the top. They can still reach about halfway down, but never really let it get less than halfway in that depth of that trough. And then vitamins and minerals, there's a lot of options out there. Once again, that's a whole other spiel that we can go into in future conversations. But we want to make sure that we're providing them with a free choice mineral or that our complete feed has minerals in them. The vitamins that we want to make sure are included because the rumen cannot synthesize them are vitamins A and E. The body can synthesize B and D. That's what's fantastic about the rumen is that they can take cobalt and turn it into all 12 of the B vitamins. And so we don't necessarily have to give that unless there are other issues going on. And minerals that you want to be looking for on your tags are sodium, calcium, phosphorus, chloride, which your sodium and your chloride are going to be salt on your tags. Copper only in goat feeds. Do not feed copper to sheep. Magnesium, iodine, sulfur, selenium, and zinc. Okay, so we've got some background information out of the way. Let's move into actually feeding our lambs and kids. Unfortunately, it is more complex than just feeding the offspring. If we want to set our offspring up for success, we must first feed the dam properly. So there are different stage of productions that will cause unique feeding factors. So we're going to feed our ewe or our doe, which we'll refer to generally as the dam, in late gestation and early lactation. And then our lambs and our kids or our offspring will be from birth to weaning and weaning to finish. So when we start talking about dam nutrition, we're doing this because we want to provide a best chance of survival for that offspring. So we call this time fetal programming. And so we're providing that fetus with absolutely everything that it needs to survive during that time, but also everything that it needs to survive successfully once it hits the ground. And so everything that we feed can control the health, growth, and reproductive performance of those offspring. There's been a lot of different research studies done on this, and small ruminants haven't gotten as much of the attention as our large ruminants have, but it is becoming more popular to investigate. So hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have some more answers about what the feeding practices that we're doing will have. But we do know that the nutrition that we feed is more significantly impactful on our multiple births, so twins and triplets, compared to our single animals. And it's also more impactful in breeding stock compared to market stock. And that's simply because our breeding stock are going to live longer. And so what we are doing in the womb is going to make a longer impact on the things that are going to live longer. And you also have to think that she is the sole source of nutrition for these lambs and kids for her entire pregnancy and also for the first few weeks of their life. So it's vital that we feed them properly. Now, during that late gestation period, it's the last 4 to 6 weeks of her pregnancy, 70% of that fetal growth is going to be occurring. So those nutrient requirements are going to be a lot higher because she is going to be growing so much of that fetus that she hadn't been growing in the beginning of her pregnancy. Her mammary system is also developing. So we want to set her up for the best success in order to be able to nurse a healthy offspring. It's also important to note that her rumen capacity is decreasing. So the bigger that the baby gets inside, the less room that she's got with all of her other organs going on, especially the rumen. And just in general, a lot more nutrition is needed because we want to be able to birth vibrant and healthy offspring of a moderate weight. We don't want too light of lambs and kids, and we definitely don't want too heavy of lambs and kids because both can cause issues not only for the lambs and kids, but also for the ewe or the doe. And we also want to prevent pregnancy toxemia and milk fever during late gestation. So we want to make sure that we are meeting those nutrient requirements. So her energy and protein requirements are going to drastically increase during this time because she is creating another life, and it's possible that she's creating 3 to 4 lives. And so we have to make sure that we are understanding A, how many fetuses is she carrying, and B, what does that nutrition need to look like? She cannot typically get enough energy from forage alone, and that is because the rumen only has so much space. So over here, this is in the beginning of the first 2 to 3 weeks of gestation. And over here on the right, on the bottom, we've got the last 4 to 6 weeks of gestation. So the bigger that fetus gets, the more that rumen is compressed. And the rumen is comprised of, down in the bottom, we have a whole bunch of liquid. In the middle, we've got what we call a fiber mat. So this is where all of the hay is going to sit that's going to get regurgitated. And then up top, we've got gas. So this is where that methane production is occurring. And so there's only so much room in here. And the first thing that's got to go is that gas. So if there's not enough gas in here to keep the rumen happy, she's not going to be able to keep the rest of her body happy. So it's typical that we have to supplement some type of grain during this time to meet her energy needs because we need to provide a higher source of nutrition with less bulk density. So our forages are going to create what's called a scratch factor, and they're going to keep that rumen churning, but because they are much longer, stemmier particles, she has to regurgitate so many times to break it down to really compact that. Kind of think of like an Easter basket when you're putting that really awful grass in there that takes up all of that space and it gets absolutely everywhere. That grass that's sitting in that Easter basket, if you were to tear it up into smaller pieces like confetti, it's going to take up less space as confetti than it is as that grass. And so if we are now feeding corn and barley, that's going to act as the confetti and it's going to sit and mix well with that Easter grass rather than just adding more and more of that grass and overflowing the Easter basket. It's also important to note that that nutrition level is dependent on her weight. And so a bigger ewe or doe is going to require more energy and more protein than a smaller ewe or doe. Our first time moms are going to require more energy and more protein than our second to fifth time moms because that ewe or doe that is a first time mom, she is still developing herself. So she needs a lot more energy to make sure that she's developing and her offspring are developing. It's also going to take a lot more nutrients to feed 3 fetuses than it's going to feed 1 fetus. And we also want to know what our production goals are. Are we feeding a meat goat? Are we feeding a dairy goat? Are we feeding a show animal? That's a whole nother beast when it comes to feeding our livestock. So it's important to know what your goal of production is. And then the most important thing is that we want to hit the sweet spot. We don't want to overfeed because we don't want to create excess fat on the mother because a fatter ewe is harder to deal with when she is in that late gestation, but also a bigger fetus is harder for her to expel. And so we want to make sure that we're hitting the sweet spot, but also not underfeeding because smaller lambs and kids have a harder time of surviving. And if they don't have enough of that energy, then they're not going to do well on the ground. So we really want to target that body condition score of 3 or 3.5. So in that late gestation period, there is a drastic increase in calcium requirements. This is because she is developing bones in the fetuses, but also she is developing her mammary system. And so we want to make sure that we are providing enough calcium during that time, that we are not going to put her into a milk fever situation where the calcium that she is having to do is now having to come from her bones rather than circulating. We want it to be coming into the rumen and going right into the bloodstream, not having her pull from those reserves. We want to make sure that she's getting selenium and vitamin E to prevent any white muscle disease. We want to feed a coccidiostat. So this is a really easy time for a ewe and for her offspring to contract coccidiosis. And so we want to make sure that we're feeding a coccidiostat to make sure that we are able to prevent that. Bovatec is approved for sheep, Rumensin is approved for goats, and Decox is approved for both. It's also important to note that if you have horses on your property and you are raising them alongside your sheep or your goats in the same pasture, that you do not give them access to that feed with a coccidiostat in it. All 3 of these products are extremely lethal to horses. Over the summer, there was an incident where the wrong batch of feed was given to a big rodeo stock, and unfortunately, several hundred horses passed away because they consumed a coccidiostat. So make sure that if you are raising all livestock in one pasture, that your horses cannot access this. We also want to make sure that we are preparing the dam's passive immunity. And so we want to set her up for success to make sure that her lambs and kids are going to be having those antibodies in place to succeed once they hit the ground because we don't vaccinate at birth. And so we want to vaccinate her 4 to 6 weeks before lambing and kidding with a CD&T shot to prevent any clostridial diseases. And we want to make sure that that immunity is then passed on through her colostrum and through her milk to that lamb or kid. We also want to move her into that lambing space for antibodies. So if you're going to lamb in a barn, potentially consider the idea of having some lambing jugs, but also an open pen where you can put your ladies in waiting so that they can get exposed to some of those environmental factors as well. We also want to make sure that we have enough feeder space with room to spare. So these pictures on the left, we've got different types of feeders. So we got a hay rack up top and we've got a supplement grain feeder down at the bottom. With this one up top, we could probably fit about 3 to 4 head comfortably on each side. So if we have 12 sheep or goats, that is not enough space if we are only using this feeder because we want to make sure that every animal can get feed at one time. We don't ever want there to be competition for feed amongst each other and causing fighting and hierarchies and all those issues. Same with the bottom here. Now this picture is probably taken out of context and I'm sure there's multiple feeders like this in this field. And so we want to make sure that we are having ample space for her during this time because we don't want to create any more stress during that late gestation. And if possible, we do want to separate them by the age of the dam and by the number of offspring because they do have different nutrient requirements. We want to make sure that we can meet those. At minimum, we want to make sure that we can at least separate a yearling from a mature ewe or doe. You don't necessarily always know how many offspring your girls are going to have unless you ultrasound. So at minimum, we want to separate them by age because they do have different needs. Back to that feeder space, if you look here in these two pictures, these both have plenty of space for these animals to not be competing. And so there's plenty of space here with some extra to spare, so that way they've got plenty of room to put an animal next to them on either side, or they can move and go to a new spot and not have to fight another animal. And then it's also important to note that feeders do not have to be pretty. They do not have to be brand spanking new. You don't have to go to the local co-op and buy the best of the best. You can make your own and you can make do. When I was growing up, we had a lot of those 50-gallon blue drums around, and my dad took a Sawzall and cut them in half, and we created water troughs out of them, and then we cut them in half long ways and we created feeders out of them. Facebook Marketplace is your friend when it comes to that. Make do with what you have. A fed lamb is better than a hungry lamb, and they don't care how fancy your setup is. Immediately after she gives birth is going to be a strange time. She just went through an extremely harsh experience. She will not want to eat right away, and that's okay. We want to make sure that we were feeding her well in that late gestation, so that way she can pull some of those body reserves in those first 24 hours after birth. We want to make sure that she is fed right so that the colostrum can be high enough quality from her previous feeding. And then if we do have mothers that are just lambing or kidding singles, those are the ewes, especially your older ones. That's who we want to collect and freeze colostrum from for other ones that might have a little bit more difficulty. We also want to make sure that she is having plenty of ice-free, clean and fresh water. Some people will even feed or give access to warm water. Really just depends on what your setup is, but make sure that she can get to water at all times during this period. We also want to make sure that we are now starting to feed her the best quality hay or pasture that we have. A legume or a legume grass mix is going to be your best option because legumes fix nitrogen, so they're going to have more protein in that hay or that pasture. And so this is going to be our highest quality forage that we can provide for them. We also want to hold off on grain for the first 24 hours just because that's a lot of energy shock to the system, and it can cause a little bit of disruption to their rumen as well during that time, because the rumen is also dealing with the fact that its competitor was just expelled from the body. During early lactation, this is when her nutritional requirements are going to be the highest. Her first 6 to 8 weeks of lactation, there's going to be a 36% increase in energy requirements and a 60% increase in protein requirements. And it is going to be determinate off of the number of offspring, and that will determine what her requirements are. Like I said, this is when we want to feed our best quality hay. A general rule of thumb during this time is that you're going to potentially want to supplement, because once again, she cannot consume enough forage to meet her energy requirements. So typical rule of thumb is 1 pound of grain per lamb or kid that she had, or give her access to a significantly better pasture. She is going to use some of those body reserves for optimum performance, and it is okay if she is losing some of that weight and body condition. So if she dips from a 3.5 to a 2, or that's a little bit concerning, but a 3.5 to a 3 or a 3 to a 2.5, that's perfectly fine, because she is having to pull from those energy reserves to make sure that she is okay and her offspring are okay. She's in a negative energy balance when this is happening. So she is expending more energy than she can take in, or that is required. And like I said before, if we can separate them by age and offspring, we always want to try and do that. If not, feed for the highest requirement. So back in 2007, which now seems like forever ago, the National Research Council, which now is renamed to the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they created a new nutrient requirements for our small ruminants. The previous edition was in like 1981, so it had been some time. And the 2007 one is still not perfect. I'm hoping within the next 5 to 7 years there will be another reprint, because there are some things that are a little bit questionable going through it. But the best example that we have for our small ruminants is our sheep. It has gotten the most research compared to goats, llamas, alpacas, all of that. So it has the most reliable forms of data. When she is at her maintenance requirement, she is going to take in about 2.6 pounds a day for a 154-pound mature ewe. That's about how much she's going to eat. When we are breeding her, her intake is going to increase. When she's in her early gestation, it is going to increase. Her late gestation is almost going to be double that of what it would take just to keep her alive. And her early lactation is definitely going to be double of that maintenance. And so she is going to need to eat more to make sure that those nutrients are happening. And those fractions of those nutrients, about 1.37 pounds of that 2.6 pounds is going to be energy that she is going to need. So in the forms of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. When she is lactating, this is going to be her highest energy demand. She's going to need 2.89 pounds of the 4.37 pounds that she is consuming. For her protein requirements, it's going to be lowest at maintenance and highest at early lactation. So as you can see, the farther along she is, not only in life, but also in her ability to produce an offspring, the more energy intake and protein that she is going to need. If we convert that into something that makes more sense on a feed tag, rather than, oh, I need to feed my sheep 2.89 pounds a day of energy, what that looks like is in a early lactation, she's going to consume 4.4-ish pounds a day of dry matter. So in a hay, you can round that up to about 5 total pounds when you're putting it in the bunk. That is going to be a 66.2% TDN on a feed tag or on a nutrient analysis of your forage. Her protein is going to be about 15.5% crude protein. So that's kind of how you take that information from your energy and protein requirements and turn it into something that you can read on your feed tag. You're going to take that requirement and divide it by your dry matter intake. If we look at a 132-pound mature doe, that is a dairy doe bearing twins, she's going to follow a similar pattern. She is going to increase the farther along she is in that period. Her early lactation is going to be the highest requirement for dry matter intake, energy, and protein. Those are going to drastically increase more so than they would for a regular ewe or for a meat goat because she is producing milk. So think of her as a well-oiled machine like a dairy cow. That's how much energy she's going to need in her small body is she's going to be producing like a dairy cow would, but on a smaller scale. So her energy requirements are going to be higher than a typical meat doe or a sheep. So if we translate that into things that are a little bit easier from those requirements, she's going to need about 53.1% TDN in that early gestation, 66 in the late gestation. And you can see here it kind of drops off on what that percentage looks like, but that's simply because we have to get so much intake into her. So a lot of the times in this situation, we're going to still feed a high quality, something around the 60s, but it's going to be less weight than that 5.76 pounds. So we're going to increase our energy so that way we can still meet those demands and not necessarily have to worry about getting that much feed into her. And your crude protein is going to range from 9% to 13.1%. Now, for all of your meat goat people out there like me, unfortunately, the requirement calculations that they published in 2007 are not necessarily accurate. And they came out and said that they weren't accurate, but they have not come out with a better model yet. And what they say for meat goats is that late gestation is the highest energy requirement. If you are more experienced at raising meat goats, you know that's not necessarily true, that she's still going to need a lot of energy and protein during that early lactation period. And so more so general rule of thumb, keep these numbers as like a good reference point, but kind of more so follow the pattern of your sheep and your dairy goat until we can get better standards published. There's been a lot of research out of Langston University over the last 5 to 10 years trying to correct those equations. And the problem is that we were not funding research for goats because it was not a main source of protein and meat in the United States, although it is such a large red meat consumed around the world. It is just now receiving the recognition that it deserves to have research conducted. And so hopefully next 5 to 7 years, we've got some better requirements, but follow the same rule of thumb as your sheep and dairy goats. So here in front of you, you've got the nutrient requirements broken down by pounds for a 154-pound mature ewe. So we are going to focus on how do we feed her during her late gestation and early lactation if she is feeding twins. So we need to have about 4 to 4.37 pounds of dry matter in her body every single day, with about 60% of that coming from energy and 10 to 15% coming from protein. So a common forage around here in a lot of the eastern United States is feeding orchard grass hay. When we look at our orchard grass hay, it's got an 89% dry matter, which means that 11% of that hay is water. 61% of it is TDN and 11% of it is crude protein. This is a pretty average quality orchard grass hay and pretty readily available in most places and most suppliers. So we decide that we are going to feed her about 4.5 pounds of dry matter a day. So that way we can meet both of these intake requirements and she can kind of pick through, and we give her a little bit extra to make sure she's eating enough and we're not underfeeding her. So if we figure out that we're feeding her 4.5 pounds of dry matter, we divide that by what our dry matter percentage is. That means that we are going to feed her 5.06, so 5.1 pounds of hay directly to her. So AF means as fed. So that means you're taking the feed right out of the bag in a feed scoop, or you're throwing hay right at her, not doing anything to it. That means that it's exactly as you're feeding it. Those 4.5 pounds of dry matter times this energy is going to be about 2.75 pounds of TDN and about half a pound of crude protein. So if we look back up here, this orchard grass hay, if we feed her 4.5 pounds a day of dry matter, so 5 pounds total, it's going to meet her requirements for late gestation. However, we are going to be slightly under in our energy and a little bit more than slightly under in our crude protein. So what if we up that to 5 pounds a day? Well, we're now going to have to feed her over 5.5 pounds of hay as fed. She's now going to get 3 pounds of TDN and 0.55 pounds of crude protein. Once again, her late gestation, we're still meeting her requirements with lots to spare. We are meeting her nutrient or her energy requirement, but we are still not meeting her protein requirement. We are still deficient in the protein that she needs. Rumen fill is going to be your limiting factor. The rumen can only take so much. Unlike or like us, she will get an upset stomach and she is just not going to be able to deal with it. She will go off feed if you are putting too much in her because she's going to have to ruminate a lot more to make more room for the next feeding to go into. So we want to use feeds that meet requirements within those total intake limits or slightly above. So same feeding scenario. What if we now feed alfalfa hay? It's a higher quality product because it is a legume. So it's going to have a much higher crude protein, but it's going to have a similar, if not lower, nutrient requirement because the energy that that plant used produced protein rather than fiber. And this is about a fair to excellent quality alfalfa, so it's going to be on your better end. So if we do the same thing where we try and feed her 4.5 pounds a day, we are now going to feed 5 pounds total, 2.7 pounds of energy, and 0.81 pounds of crude protein. Once again, this is going to meet our requirements for our gestating. It's going to really exceed that crude protein, so we're going to have a lot of lost protein, but it's still not going to meet her energy for her early lactation. So same thing again. What happens if we increase how much we're feeding of it? It will meet all of her energy requirements for late gestation and for early lactation. However, the same principles apply. Is she going to be able to consume that much alfalfa? And alfalfa is expensive. Most of alfalfa production is geared towards dairy cattle and horses, so they're going to have a higher price tag to them. And so we want to save that more expensive, better quality product for our lactation because here we're providing her with almost double her crude protein requirements. And when that starts to happen, she's just going to excrete it out the back end. She's only going to be able to use so much of it. And so we don't want to be wasteful with what we're feeding. But also, we can consider other legumes or legume mixes. I know there's a wives' tale that red clover, the phytoestrogens can kind of mess with things, but over the years, we've kind of solved that wives' tale that it's not really going to mess with anything. And so you can feed red clover. You can feed a whole bunch of different legume mixes. You can have alfalfa, Bermuda grass. You can have a whole bunch of different ways to do that, but still meet some of those requirements on a cheaper budget. So what if we now introduce grain? The question then becomes, what is the right grain? So if we're feeding that orchard grass hay, we're still going to stick to this 4.5 total pounds. A, because it's easy math, and B, because it's providing everything that we need with a little bit extra so we know she's getting enough. So, like we talked about earlier, general rule of thumb is about a pound of grain. And so you could go up to 2 pounds since she's giving twins, but we'll make the math easy and go to just 1 pound. So we're going to feed her almost 4 pounds of orchard grass hay, and that's going to give us 2.1 pounds of energy and about 3.9 or 0.39 pounds of crude protein. So we're going to choose corn for this, A, because it's cheap, and B, because we can get it just about anywhere. If we feed 1 pound, she's going to get 0.9 pounds of TDN and almost 1/10 of a pound of crude protein. This gives us 3 pounds of TDN and 0.48 pounds of crude protein. So once again, late gestation is going to be met. early lactation is still not going to meet her crude protein requirements. What if we feed soybean meal? Same thing, same math. We are now having 2.735 pounds of energy and almost 0.69 pounds of crude protein. Well, soybean meal is a much denser crude protein feed, but it has a lot less energy. So now the opposite is true. She is going to meet her crude protein requirements in that early lactation, but now she's not going to meet her energy requirements. The problems with grains is there is not one size fits all. And if there was, it would be available everywhere and someone would be a millionaire. Usually we have to feed some sort of blend or a complete feed if that's easier, if you can't get to a co-op or you don't have the equipment or you don't want to mix 50-50 every single day. But we can feed corn and soybean meal very easily. Corn provides us a very high energy, while our soybean meal provides us a very high protein. So if we feed to meet those requirements, and hopefully we'll do another series later on down the year more about nutrition to kind of teach you some at-home mathematics tricks to figure this out. But if we feed 0.4 pounds of corn and 0.6 pounds of soybean meal, we can meet all of our requirements for late gestation and for early lactation without necessarily being wasteful. So you can feed a full forage during that late gestation. You can feed a higher quality forage during that late gestation. It's more expensive to do that and you'll have a lot more waste. You can feed a forage and you can supplement grain during that time. It's a lot easier to meet those requirements in late gestation than it is to meet them in early lactation. So we want to make sure that we are considering all aspects of how things need to be fed and how to best reach that way. There is no one best option. It's the best option for you and for your farm. Some people prefer completely grass-fed. Some people like to supplement with grain, and some people only like to supplement with grain when it's absolutely necessary, like a drought or the winter. You need to do what's best for you and your budget. But take into consideration that at the end of the day, we need to make sure that everything is being fed properly. So, in summary of feeding the mother, we want to create feeding groups if at all possible by her stage of production. So, feed late gestating ewes separate from our lactating ewes. Keep feeding the ones that haven't given birth yet differently than the ones that have. If we know her number of offspring, if we've got 10 goats, 5 of them had singles and 5 of them had twins, feed in groups of 5. We also want to feed our young differently than our old. Forage feeding is typically the most economical. You can feed from the pasture, you can feed in hay, silage, baleage, whatever it is. But typically during those more crucial nutrient times, we cannot consume enough forage to meet her needs because the fetus is pushing on that rumen, or that rumen is still adjusting from what just happened of expelling that fetus. And we just cannot get enough of those big bulky forages into her body. So supplement when you need to, or feed a better quality forage. You can supplement one single feedstuff, just corn, just soybean meal. You can blend 2 feedstuffs, corn and soybean meal. Or you can feed a commercial feed, or you can talk to your local co-op nutritionist about a custom ration. Typically during this time, we want to go to a 14 to 18% crude protein range when we are supplementing. That's kind of like that target goal of the grain that we are feeding. If you are wanting to screenshot anything in the presentation to kind of help you feed and go about, this is a table broken down of those graphs of your 154-pound ewe, your 132-pound non-dairy doe, and your dairy doe. In those parentheses, I have listed out what the translation of TDN pounds to dry matter pounds and crude protein to dry matter pounds is in percentages to kind of look for in your forage analysis and your feed tags. So if you want me to go back to this slide at the end or send you a copy of this presentation so you can see this, let me know, but we'll go ahead and move on. So now we get into the nitty gritty of, we've got these offspring on the ground. How do we feed them? There are kind of 4 to 5-ish stages of feeding our lambs and our kids. Early nursing, nursing, weaning, growing, and finishing. Early nursing is when we're going to get that colostrum. And over the last 4 weeks, we have really pounded in colostrum, what it is, what it does, why we need it. There are 3 cues when it comes to colostrum: quickly, quantity, and quantity. Colostrum needs to be received within the first 24 hours of life. No questions. But it needs to be received within the first 6 to 12 hours if possible. We want to make sure that he or she is getting the most amount of colostrum in that first 6 to 12 hours of life, because that's when they are able to absorb those antibodies and absorb those nutrients the best. We want to make sure that we're getting enough colostrum in them. So we want to aim, if we're going to have to supplement colostrum, if we're going to have to milk out another ewe or a doe or feed a supplement, it needs to be about 10 to 15% of birth weight in ounces is kind of what that'll translate to. And then quality. We want to make sure that there are maternal antibodies in there. So you can customize what your colostrum is going to look like. If you are in a really harsh barn, that's maybe not as fantastic as you would like it to be, you bought an old property, introduce your ewe or your doe into that barn so that she becomes acclimated to that environment and all of those air particles floating around, all of those things living in your bedding, all that good stuff. Introduce it to her as soon as you can during those last 4 to 6 weeks so that her colostrum will have antibodies for those babies in her milk. You can also do it by vaccination, like we talked about earlier. 4 to 6 weeks prior to birth, make sure she's fully vaccinated for a CD&T shot. It's also going to be rich in nutrition. So we want to feed her properly during that late gestation because we want that colostrum to have fantastic protein, fat, sugar, and fat-soluble vitamins so those kids and lambs have the best chance at success over the next couple days. That lamb or kid is going to nurse extremely heavily, if not solely, for the first 2-3 weeks of life. They're going to start to nibble on forage, and if you're supplementing her with grain and they can hop up in that feed bin, they're going to start nibbling on that as well. Their roughage interest and intake should increase by about 4 to 6 weeks. They are going to be intaking a noticeable amount of pasture or hay that you are feeding them. And then during this time, there are 3 ways to feed. You don't have to supplement at all. So we allow our lambs and kids to nurse and eat whatever the dams eat. So they're only on pasture, they eat pasture. This is the cheapest way because that grass is already there. We can supplement our ewes or our does. So we're only providing grain to the dam. And the theory is if our milk is improved, our lamb and kid growth will improve. Or we can supplement our lambs and our kids only. So we don't give the dam access to the feed. Only those lambs and kids can get access to it. This usually results in better growth because they're getting a higher plane of nutrition. And we call this creep feeding. There are 2 different types of creep feeding. The first is creep feeding with grain. So we're providing supplemental nutrients outside that milk via grain. We want to start introducing little bits of grain within 1 to 2 weeks of age so they kind of know what it is, they're kind of playing with it, and it's not as foreign to them. We want that ration to be about 18 to 20% crude protein. Some people will tell you 18 is best, some people will tell you 20% is best. Whatever works best for your pocketbook is best in this case. We want to make sure that it's palatable, so we don't want giant pellets. We want to make sure that the pellets are small. We want to make sure that it could be a textured feed and that it's broken up well and that they can chew it and get a hold of it. We also want to make sure that it's fresh. We don't want moldy feed ever. And we want to make sure that it's dry. As they start to get a little bit older, a couple weeks onto that creep feed, as they're really adjusting to a more creep feed, we want to make sure that that feed has ammonium chloride in it. What this does is it prevents urinary calculi in wethers and rams. So this is kind of like a kidney stone, but because of the shape of the male urinary tract, they cannot expel that kidney stone. So it gets lodged into that urethra and it can cause a lot of issues. And this is a result of too much phosphorus compared to calcium in the diet. And that ammonium chloride can break apart that interaction so that this doesn't happen. So we want to make sure that our creep feed has a calcium to phosphorus ratio of 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 at minimum. 3-to-1 is better. We also want to feed a coccidiostat to keep them healthy. Like I said, Bovatec is for sheep, Rumensin is approved for goats, and Decox is approved for both. Keep it away from your horses. Another way that we're starting to steal from our cattle friends is creep grazing. So this is providing those supplemental nutrients via pasture. So there are multiple ways that you can go about this, but basically they are grazing in front of the dam. So we are providing them with higher quality pasture or browse. I've seen some people where they will cut down a fresh blooming tree and they will put it in a pen for their baby goats, so that those goats can get a hold of those blossoms and those berries before the mothers do. We want that forage to be in a vegetative state, and so we want it to make sure that it's really high quality. And we want our pasture height or our sward height to be high compared to the sheep and goats, because this will decrease our parasite burden during a time when we haven't introduced them to an anthelmintic, and we don't want to introduce them into an anthelmintic at this point, because the higher that they graze, the less likely they are to consume parasites from the ground. So there's gates that you can use so that only the lambs can go through rather than the mothers, and they can get to that pasture. They can look in all different ways. It can even be a wire on temporary fencing. But basically the idea is that there's some sort of creep gate or some sort of prevention for our bigger does and ewes that they cannot pass into this area. This area is going to be small and it's going to have much more lush pasture than what's going on over here for our mothers. And this is giving them a higher plane of nutrition to use. You can also do it with a rotational style. So if you want to cut up into more paddocks and you want to create ways so that way she's still getting some decent nutrition, you can rotate her differently and you can rotate the creep grazing so that way when you come back to this first paddock, it's growing faster and it's back into that really lush stage again. There's a lot of different ways to set up your creep feeder. When we talk about creep feedings, we talk about the areas you're going to be creep feeding, and then we're also going to talk about what type of feeders to use in that grain situation. We want some sort of panel with openings that are, like I said, just big enough for the lambs to get through, but not too big that the dam can get through and go to town on a banana split sundae bar. We want to make sure that she is blocked off from this area. We also want to make sure that it is clean, dry, and has water potentially in this area if it's going to be in a barn or in a pasture, because we want to encourage them to go in there. So those slats need to be between 4 to 6 inches in width. It's better if they're adjustable, so that way you can kind of move them as the lamb or kid is growing. And it can be pre-assembled or it can be DIY. So here we've got some that are made from pallets or made from rebar that's covered in PVC so they're not getting their hair caught on it. Perfectly fine. But we've also got some ones that are manufactured that for people that aren't necessarily as handy or want to spend on something made of metal rather than wood. There's also these options as well. So they come in all different shapes and sizes, and there is no right way of going about it. When it comes to our feeders, we want there to be troughs or self feeders. So this up here is what we call a self feeder, where we dump in 100 pounds of grain and we let them go through it for the next 2 weeks, and we don't have to check on it every single day to make sure there's plenty in there. A trough is going to be something more like a bucket or a feeding pan here, to where you're filling it kind of every single day. The biggest idea is that we want to prevent wastage and fecal contamination. So we don't necessarily want to feed on the ground, but we want to make sure that they've got something to eat out of. An ample feeder space. We want 2 to 3 inches of head if we're going to self-feed them, so putting it in something like this, or we want 8 to 12 inches of head if we're feeding all at once, because if we're feeding all at once, they're competing with each other at one time. self-feeding, they can go in there at any time, and not all of them are going to eat at the same time. The biggest question I always get asked is, when the heck do I wean my animals? That is up to you, but there are some general rules of thumb. And I encourage you to do the research in the literature to see which option is going to fit your production system the best. So early weaning is anything that's before 60 days old. It can be considered more economical because you're not having to feed the dam quite as long for her to produce as high of quality milk. So you're pulling her off a lot sooner. And so now you're just having to feed much smaller animals rather than feeding a lactating animal at a higher plane. You can get her back to maintenance faster. It does increase stress on the dam and offspring because they have a much shorter bond and because there isn't necessarily a full development of independence yet. Late weaning is 16 to 24 weeks old. This will decrease stress on dam and offspring because that offspring has started to learn its independence. And so they're not reliant on mom. And mom, by that point, is probably barely producing any milk. So it's very natural and a very easy way to wean them off. There's less mastitis because she is naturally being dried off. We're going to have to increase forage quality during this time because our lambs and our kids are going to be a lot bigger at 24 weeks old than they would at 60 days. So now she's going to have more competition with the dam. So creep grazing might be a really great strategy here. But it does increase the chance for offspring parasitism because they are going to be grazing closer to the ground and grazing more at that age. The middle ground of weaning is weaning at about 8 to 12 weeks old. The goal is to more so wean at a particular weight rather than a particular age. For our lambs, we want to wean at about 2.5 to 3 times their birth weight, where kids kind of 2 to 2.5 times that birth weight. Now, it is breed or species dependent, and you'll find a lot of different options out there, but about 33 to 55 pounds. And at this 8 to 12 weeks, by about 4 months of age, the rumen is fully developed. So when they're first born, they have what we call an esophageal groove. So that milk is going directly into the abomasum and it's bypassing the rumen because the abomasum is like a true stomach. So it's like your stomach, a pig's stomach, and it's able to break down the lactose and the casein that's in the milk. Once they get older, that groove starts to disappear, and now feed and forage and milk are being dropped into the rumen rather than the abomasum. So we want to make sure during this time that we're giving them the best chance of success. So if that rumen is fully developed, they have a better chance of adapting, to that plane of nutrition that they're now going to be on. This middle ground also reduces stress on the offspring, and it can reduce stress on the dam. And overall, that is the number one priority when it comes to weaning. We want to make this as uncomplicated and the least amount of stress as possible. During this time, if you're creep feeding, you're going to decrease your crude protein as they get closer to weaning. You're still going to make sure that they're getting a coccidiostat, and if you're not feeding grain, then a coccidiostat needs to be available in the water, or it needs to be available in your mineral package. We want to make sure that we're vaccinating our lambs and our kids with a CD&T shot at about 6 to 8 weeks of age and a booster at 10 to 12 weeks of age, that they're consuming plenty of feed and pasture prior to help that rumen develop and make sure that they can survive off of this feed and pasture. And we want to ensure that the dam can regain her body weight. So we are wanting to make sure that we're not leaving her on there too long, that she can't regain, but we're not providing her with enough nutrients. We want to make sure we're setting her up for success as well. There are 3 different types of weaning. Abruptly weaning, extremely stressful if you do not do it carefully. You're cutting off all contact on a specific day. There is no sight, there is no sound. You're moving them to a completely different place, and they will never interact for the next couple weeks again. Gradual weaning is you're reducing the time spent with the dam over several days. So this could be if you're creep grazing or you're creep feeding, you're now setting up a temporary fence between moms and children, so that way they aren't exposed to them every single day. This is about the midway level of creating stress. If done properly, it's pretty low. If you're loud and excited, they're going to be loud and excited. You also need to increase your labor during this time and resources to make sure that you're feeding the dam and the offspring well. And then fence line weaning is kind of what we do in the cattle industry. We're separating them by a secure fence, but we're doing it so that they remain within sight and sound. So it's decreasing stress because they can still see her, but she's adapting to that independence. And then finally, how do you grow and finish your lambs? Well, that's dependent on your production roles. So if you're feeding out for show, typically it's going to be that you're wanting to dry lot them, as we call. Mostly it's going to be grain with some roughage. I don't necessarily love when our show animals are getting absolutely no hay or grass. We want to make sure that they're still getting the things that make the rumen environment happy. Too much grain does not, the microbes do not like if you're feeding 100% grain. At minimum, 10 to 15% of their total diet should be some sort of roughage. We want to begin with a 16% crude protein during this time after we've weaned them, and we want to finish them at their finishing weight at about 12% crude protein. If we're going to pasture them, we can finish them with supplementation. So we're still grazing them out or feeding forage, but we're providing extra nutrients during critical periods. So breeding, flushing, winter, drought, etc., getting them to that end stage, whatever it may be, if it's replacement females, bucks, or market wethers. This is when we supplement when we think we need to. And then there's the way of feeding just pasture or pasture and browse or browse only. There is no grain. This is a more natural way of doing things, but it is not the easiest way necessarily because it does require intentional and thoughtful stewardship of both the land and your livestock. You need to have a plan of how you're going to use the available forage and space that you have to adequately meet all of the nutrient requirements of the different livestock and different stages that you are feeding. So grass-fed is perhaps the more finessed way of feeding livestock because it is so intentional and how you're going to do it to make sure that you are taking care of the land and taking care of your livestock. There is no right or perfect way to go about it. And anyone that tells you that there is a right way is wrong. There is no right way, but there are plenty of wrong ways. You can do a lot of these things in this experience, and you will figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. There are pros and cons to both grass feeding and grass finishing and grain feeding and grain finishing. If we're going to grain feed and grain finish, we're going to have superior growth because grain creates better energy for the animal to use. They're going to reach market sooner because they are going to have more body weight put on. It's going to be a milder flavored meat. So if you don't like that lamb taste or that Chevin taste, that's what we call goat meat, it is going to be less gamey. You're also going to decrease your parasite incidence. Parasites come from the grass and the soil. So if you're introducing more grain and they're eating out of a trough, they're not going to interact with the soil as much. However, you are going to produce fatter carcasses and it's going to be more costly. If you're going to go the pasture and browse route of finishing and growing, you're going to have leaner carcasses and it can be more economical. There's also that consumer demand for grass-fed. So you might be able to sell to a niche market and really be able to get your product out there. However, you are going to increase your parasite incidence because they will be grazing, and absolutely no one is a perfect steward of the land and the livestock. There will be parasites on your fields and your livestock will consume them. So it's going to happen, and it's going to happen more often on our pasture-based systems. You also need more pasture to do 100% pasture-based. You just need more land in order to do that. So thank you for sticking with me. To summarize, we always want to provide clean and fresh water. If you ever call me, if you're in the Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia area, and you call me out for a consult, I want to see that you have plenty of water that is clean and fresh available for your livestock. Now, I'm not telling you to go and scrub tanks absolutely every single day, but they need to be clean and they need to be free of debris and feed and everything else. They deserve the right to have clean and fresh water at all times. We also want to make sure that any changes in their feed, we do it gradually. So if we are going to introduce alfalfa hay from our orchard grass hay, start to blend them. Start with introducing 25% of that total number being alfalfa and slowly work your way up 50%, 75%, 100%. Same with grain. We do not want to cause an abrupt change to the ruminant environment because you're really going to have some unhappy goats and sheep on your hands. We want to make sure that we understand that our nutritional needs are going to change with the stage of production of our sheep and goats and with their weight. Feeding the dam is just as important as feeding the lamb and the kid because she's going to set them up for success. We also want to make sure that our proper health measures accompany our proper nutrition, vaccinations, coccidiostats, all of those good things. Most importantly, you need to figure out what your production goals and priorities are and match your feeding strategy accordingly. Like I said, there is no one right way to feed sheep and goats. There are plenty of wrong ways, but the right way for you may not be the right way for your neighbor. So figure out what works for you and your checkbook and for you and your livestock. At the end of the day, well-fed livestock produce high-quality meat, milk, fiber, and offspring, and that is our goal completely at the end of the day. It doesn't matter how you get to the finish line, as long as you're getting a healthy product across the finish line, that's all that matters. So, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and start asking them. First, I'm going to put into the chat a PDF copy of the 2007 Nutrient Requirements of Small Ruminants, and also a body condition fact sheet published by the University of Kentucky. So feel free to download those if you're interested in them. The PDF for the NRC 2007 has nutrient tables in there. Everything's in kilograms, so you'll have to do some math, but that'll kind of help you figure out what those look like.